of adjusting to technology. So anyhow, in this afternoon session, what I would like to do is to discuss approaches to Buddhist studies and research. But basically what I'm going to do in this discussion is discuss research methodology. So in fact, I will be discussing this topic in detail with you. In the course of this discussion, you will be able to, some of you are MPhil and PhD research scholars, you will be able to come up with your own research, and if you are faced with any kind of difficulties or problems, we can also discuss those things in the course of this discussion. So basically what I would like to do is to discuss research methodology in general, and also then to go into different fields of Buddhist studies and see methods followed in those research areas. And also I would like to discuss some logical rules and the logical tools we are going to apply in doing research. So basically, I think a good way to start this will be to have some understanding about what we call methodology and method. These two terms, I said that I'm going to discuss research methodology with you. However, when we discuss this matter, very often we use these two terms, methodology and method, somewhat interchangeably. Although we use it that way, that use is not very correct, because when we say methodology, we mean something, and when we say method, we mean something somewhat different. Now, when we say methodology, we are talking about methodology. So on the one hand, we have method, and then we have methodology. Basically, methodology, this, this word, zoology, and so on, we are using in many disciplines, we are using this word logic. In English, this word comes from logos. Logos means word, or also it means discussion. So methodology means discussion about methodology, or methodology means academic discussion of method. Now, method means the techniques or the ways of doing research we are using in particular field. That is called method. Now, there can be many methods. There can be several methods. However, methodology means academic discussion of methods. So it is really in many advanced research institutes, methodology constitute a separate aspect of study really. So not only we are using methods, we are talking about methods. There are relative merits, which methods are good for which subjects, so on. So therefore, any kind of academic discussion of method is methodology. So methods can be many, but basically methodology means any kind of, so you can define it this way, academic discussion or academic study of methods. For example, when we look at what we are studying in the university system today, in any university, we know that we study different subjects. Among these subjects, we usually talk about what we call, we we study natural sciences, we study social sciences, also we study humanities. Now, these are basically the three areas of study we are engaged in any kind of academic the institution. So, natural sciences means basically we are studying the parts of nature. For example, when we study chemical combinations, we call it chemistry. Or when we study physical objects, we call it physics. When we study plants, we call it botany. When we study animals, we call it zoology. So like that, we are studying these aspects of nature. When we study aspects of nature, those things are called natural sciences. And social sciences are different. Social sciences means when we study societies, we call it social sciences. Now, what is society? Society is comprises human beings. So the collection of human beings we call society. So the social studies we are studying human societies, human organizations. So that is what is called social sciences. Now, basically, when we say humanities, humanities are what is to the subjects that are related to human beings, we call them humanities. So these are the three different aspects. Actually, this went off because of, I think I need to, because my computer goes off like when it is idle for 1 minute or something, I need to change it. Anyhow, these are the three main areas we are studying any academic institute. Now, interesting thing is, we cannot apply the same methods we are using for natural sciences when we study social sciences. And also, we cannot apply the same methods in which we use social sciences when we study humanities. So, for these different subjects, we need different methods. So, the natural sciences have certain methods, social sciences have certain methods, and the humanities have the certain methods. Now, under social sciences, we basically study things like we say sociology, anthropology, economics, even geography. Of course, it goes across many different areas. So things like that. When we study social sciences, we study these things. What are the humanities? Now, under humanities, we study basically things like languages, religions, sometimes culture, history, and so on. So you can see these subjects are quite different from each other. Subjects are quite different from each other. Now, natural sciences, we study natural objects. Now, when we study natural objects, we can study these trees. Of course, when we start studying these trees will not run away. Trees will be there. Or we can control these things the way we want. Sometimes we have, we are growing certain things in a greenhouse, so we can control the temperature. So the natural objects are pretty much the same. We can control them. Suppose we are studying animals. Animals also we can control them. So therefore, in studying those things, the methods we are following, we follow certain methods. However, can we study human beings in the same manner we study animals or trees? No, because human beings' behavior is very different. You can't cage them into a place and study them. You can't put them into a glass box and study them. Because human beings, I mean, they have their own life, they have their own thinking. So you study, some society can be changed in tomorrow. They can change their minds. They can change their behavior. So basically we see that the methods followed in these two are different from each other. And then when it comes to humanities, again, the methods followed can be very different. Now, among the scholars and also philosophers, there is a discussion about methodology. At some point, people believed that there can be only one method applicable to all these things, namely the scientific method. There was a lot of debates about it. Now, of course, the present situation is we don't believe that we can apply one and the same methods to everything. Methods can be different depending on the subjects we are studying. But there is an academic discussion about this method. So that academic discussion about which method is suitable for which subject is what is called methodology. Okay? Now, methodology can be somewhat like a philosophical subject, because we are studying about the suitability of the method. So therefore, methodology is the field of study itself. And then under humanities, we also study philosophy. Now, what are these things? Languages, religions, cultures, history, philosophy. Now, when we discuss these things, we know that these things belong to human being. Languages are part of human behavior. And then religion, philosophy, history, all these are part of the human behavior. Therefore, we call them humanities. Now, the methods followed in humanities again have to be very different. Now, if we look at what you are doing, what you are studying here, basically, what you study in this academic institute basically come under humanities. So, when we study humanities, what are the methods that we can apply, or we should apply, or we should be following is an important thing. In any research study, we will be looking at the methods we are following. And then in addition to these three things, natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities, we have something like this. Mathematics, logic, statistics, and things like that. Now, what do you think about these things? Where do they belong? If you take mathematics. Now, mathematics, is it natural sciences, social sciences, or humanities? Where do they belong? If you take logic, where does it belong? Or statistics, where does it belong? Interesting to see these things. In fact, in a way we can say that now basic difference would be when we study geography, we have some kind of subject matter. Like suppose we are studying geography of Myanmar, then we know certain facts about Myanmar. So in other words, geography as a subject has a content. Suppose we are studying Pali, that subject has a content. Either we study grammar or literature, that has a content. Like that, any subject. When we study zoology, we are studying about animals. So that has a content. But what about mathematics? Does mathematics have a content? What do we study when we study mathematics? Now, for simple example, we can say that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, this is a very simple mathematical thing. When we say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, What do you know about the world when we say this? Do you get any knowledge about the world when you say 2 plus 2 equals 4? Like when I say, if I say that there is a mountain, that mountain is 100 meters high. Now, you get some knowledge about the world. But when I say 2 plus 2 equals 4, do you get a knowledge about the world? Now, if I say there are 4 chairs in this room, you get some knowledge about the world, about this room and that there are 4 chairs. But if I simply say 2 plus 2 equals 4, you don't get any knowledge about the outside world. So what is mathematics really? What kind of knowledge do you get by that? Do you get any factual knowledge, facts? Do you get any facts about the world from mathematics? Actually not. Mathematics is some kind of abstraction. We call this abstraction. So we call this abstraction. Abstraction means we are not talking about any particular things. When we talk about 2 plus 2 equals 4, this 2 can be chairs, tables, books, human beings, trees, vehicles, anything. It can be anything, right? So, in other words, in studying mathematics, we are not studying anything about the world. But we organize the world in a certain manner in mathematics in order to understand. Now, if you take number 2, where is number 2? Suppose we are supposed to make an inventory of everything in this hall. We can list the tables, chairs, books, human beings and everybody. Do you think the numbers also will be included in that inventory list of things? No. Numbers are not included. Where are the numbers? Numbers are nowhere. Where do the numbers exist anyway? What do you think? I mean, there are numbers. I wrote 2 plus 2 equals 4. Where do the numbers exist? Tables and chairs exist in this hall. Where do the numbers exist? In your mind? Where do the numbers exist? I mean, numbers are not a part of the world, right? But then we talk through numbers. We count things. We do a lot of things with numbers. But numbers are abstractions. Okay? Now, also in this you can include what is called computer. Now, all these things do not have a content. But in order to study these things, we make use of these things. Is that right? In order to study natural science, we use mathematics, we use arithmetic, mathematics, very, very deep, very advanced mathematical formulas, and we use logic, we use statistics, and we use computer. Now, computing means in itself, we are computing, right? So, now these things we are studying in order to study other things, okay? These are really the supportive things. So, mathematics, logic, statistics, computers and all these things, we make use of these things in order to study these things. Now, you can see roughly when we look at what we are studying in higher academic institute, now you can see 4 areas. We study natural sciences, we study social sciences, humanities. In addition to that, we study also mathematics, computers, logic and all that. Interesting thing is, although we use mathematics in order to study other subjects, there are experts in mathematics. So, mathematics itself becomes a subject. You can be expert in mathematics. Of course, by studying mathematics, you don't know anything about the world. But you can make use of mathematics in order to organize the world in a manner you wish to study. But there are computer experts, there are statistics experts, there are mathematics expert and the mathematics department in the university. So there's a whole department that teaching mathematics, or there can be a whole department that teaching statistics, right? But then those subjects do not have a content, they only support the study of other things. Now I just wanted to give you some idea. You see, the methods are very different. The method you are using to study mathematics, you can't study other things. They are different. But on the other hand, we can make use of mathematical formulas, mathematical methods in order to, understand and, do things in easier manner. So methods can be different depending on various things. Now, these things we make use of to know the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and these comprise part of the method we are using. Now, which method goes with which subject, that type of academic discussion or academic study we call methodological study. So, in this series of discussions, what I am going to do is, we look at Buddhist studies, okay? We look at Buddhist studies and see what are the methods we can use. What are the issues related to methods, that means methodology. Now here we say under humanities we have languages. Under languages we can say Pali, okay? Under humanities we have say philosophy or religion. Under religion we can have Buddhism. Under Buddhism we can have Theravada Buddhism. Under Theravada Buddhism we can have Vinaya, you see. So you see the kind of how a particular subject coming from. So in other words, in this series of discussions, what we are doing is basically to understand the subject we are studying and also the methodological considerations. For examples, we can say simply something like this: knowledge, or we can say, better we can say academic study, okay? And then we have natural sciences, we have social sciences, we have humanities. Under humanities we have various things, okay? And then we have religion. Under religion we can have Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. Under Buddhism we can have Theravada, Mahayana, and then Vajrayana. Under Theravada, we can go further down. Now you see how we are related to one whole fabric, okay? Now, Venerables, it is very important to know what we are studying and where it is located, okay? Because not only you study, but you also study about study, what we are doing. So this kind of mapping, so academic study, it goes into these things, and from we get into humanities, to religion, various religions, to different traditions within Buddhism. Within that, when we say Theravada, we can say we study Vinaya, we study Abhidhamma, we study Sutta. So within that Sutta, you can say Digha Nikaya, and so on, so on, so on. You can go into sub branches. So what I am going to do is, discuss the methods we are using in this study. So when we, let's see. Now, another important thing is, now I think you have got some idea about method and methodology. Next thing that I am going to discuss with you is research is for the production of new knowledge. What is new knowledge in Buddhist studies? Is it similar to or different from the knowledge production in natural sciences? If so, how? Anyhow, do you have any questions or anything not clear about the things I said so far? Or is it okay? Okay, so we will move on. The next important question is the production of knowledge. Now in academic study, what we do is, by doing research, what we are doing is we are producing knowledge. Now what is new knowledge? Important thing is, whenever you do a research, what you do is you produce new knowledge. So the term is production of knowledge. Every time we study, what we do is we are engaged in production of knowledge. Now many people produce many things. What do the universities produce? Universities produce knowledge. Okay? Universities produce knowledge. Factories produce, certain things, and, hotels produce food and so on. And the university is supposed to produce knowledge. Now, producing knowledge is basically the business of research. Now, suppose you are just an undergraduate student following courses and, listening to what the teachers say and, reproducing those things in the examination. You are not producing knowledge really. What you do is you are acquiring knowledge so far produced. That's what you are doing. As an undergraduate study, we are acquiring knowledge so far produced by other people. So we say so and so said this, so and so said this, so and so said this. We learn all these things. And then we go to examination hall and we write them, so and so's idea is this and so on and so forth. So what we do is, we make use of the knowledge produced by others. That is what basically we do. And even in the MA level, if you are just doing coursework masters, you are just collecting a lot of knowledge. The knowledge is already there. You are just acquiring that knowledge and making it part of yourself. However, when you go to research, you are doing something different. There, not only that you are learning what others have done. Of course, you have to know. In order to produce something new, you have to know what is old, right? If you don't know what is the already existing knowledge, you can't produce new knowledge. So therefore, it is very important, first we know the knowledge up to this point. Suppose you are doing a research about something. If you do not know the current status of knowledge about that subject, how can you know that you are doing something new? Maybe you take so much time and, finally produce something to see that somebody has discovered it 25 years ago. So you wasted your time. That is why it is important for us to know what is the current knowledge situation of that subject. In many universities, I know when I was a graduate student, of course that practice is still there, a student had to do several months of what is called a literature survey. Of course, I was a graduate student in 1980s. That was the time, computers are being used in the universities, not like that today. So basically what the people did was went to the library, went through the journals, and they were looking for whatever the material that is relevant to their study. Now for example, I can tell you, suppose you are going to do some study about simple, say in the Buddhist studies we say karma theory. So if you want to do something about the karma theory, it is very important for you to know who are the other people who have written about karma theory. What are their ideas? What have they written about it? Now, if you don't know any of those things, how can you do a research? You can't do, because you don't know what is the status of knowledge in karma theory. Now, today, you who do research today are very lucky, because you can just go to the internet and you can type it and you can find what is being done about karma theory. I remember like 1970s, I had a friend, he had to do a research on the Dhamma. the term Dhamma. This is a Buddhist monk living in the United States those days. I know that he spent months reading all the sutras and collecting the places where the term Dhamma occurs. So he took about 1 year just to read the text and collect the material. Today, 5 minutes, you get whole thin Dhamma occurring, coming into you. No problem today. So actually today we are lucky because all those things have been provided. But 20, 30 years ago situation was not like that. However, either in the olden way or in the modern way, you have to know who has written about karma if you are writing about karma. At least in your own language. Suppose you are doing your research in Myanmar Burmese language, then you have to know what has been written in that. But today the academic world is so wide, you have to know what is written in the English language, right? But then even in the English language today is not sufficient because so many people write in German language, so many write Buddhist studies in French language, and even more than any of these things, so many people write in Japanese language. They say that Japan is the most productive country in that sense, Buddhist study. So, our knowledge is very limited with all these things because it is very difficult for us to know everything. But at least reasonably, we should know what the people have done. That's very important because if we don't know what the people have done, how can we, really produce knowledge? So therefore, the production of knowledge, that's the most important concept here. Production of knowledge. In order to produce new knowledge, you have to know what the old knowledge is. Okay? Otherwise, you can't produce new knowledge. In order to produce new knowledge, you have to know what the old knowledge is. Very often it so happens, for example, sometimes, you take a book and you edit it to see that somebody has edited it even better than you have done. So what is the use of your research? You have wasted your time. Don't misunderstand. If somebody has edited the same book, you read that book and if you find that that edition is not good, then you can do a better edition. That's fine. But somebody has edited it, he or she has edited it even better than you have done, then what? Your effort is useless. But if you did a literature survey before that, you will get the information, okay, in such and such a university, this research has already done. So, if you want to decide to repeat the same research, fine. But then you have to know about that research and you have assessment. Okay, you think that no, this research has not been done very well. So I should do it again. So there is a reason for you to do that. But if you repeated that research without knowing that somebody has done it even better than you, then of course you are in trouble. So therefore the first thing is, in production of new knowledge, it is very important that we know what already has been produced. So the first thing I want to tell you is, in research, what you are doing is producing new knowledge. Okay? Then what is not research is, suppose you are simply reporting. You are not really doing research. You are paraphrasing, summarizing somebody's view. This is not a research. Reporting is not a research. Paraphrasing is not a research. Summarizing is also not a research. And also describing something is not a research. Again, don't misunderstand. When you do a research, you will have to describe. However, describing alone is not research. Now, very often as undergraduates, what we do is we say that such and such a great teacher has said this. Such and such a great teacher has said this. We record and report everything the great teachers have reported. That's fine. But when you come to a research level, you can't simply say, so and so said this, so and so said this, so and so said this. It's okay, but you can't stop with that. Then you have to have something to be able to say, okay, so-and-so said this, but it has problems. So-and-so said this, okay, it is better. So-and-so said this, it has certain weaknesses and certain merits. So ultimately, you are not only discussing what other people did, you are also making your own contribution to it. Clear? So, describing can be a part of research. Describing is a part of research, but if you are just describing what other people said, no research. That's why in the morning we were talking about the venerable great commentator Buddhaghosa. Now, we may be doing a research on commentary. We can say venerable Buddhaghosa said this. But if your research is only that, then that is not a research. Okay. We must be able to go beyond that. We must be able to maybe compare and contrast with Buddhaghosa's ideas with Venerable Dhammapala's ideas, or with other commentaries. Or we look at the commentary, Atthakatha, and also we look at the Tika, and maybe we compare and contrast Atthakatha and Tika. There you find the research. Okay? But simply if you say this is what Buddhaghosa says, this is what Dhammapala says, that's only a reporting. Of course, even to correctly say what Buddhaghosa says, you have to have some ability. So I am not saying that that's a bad thing. Even to say so and so said this, in order to say it correctly, you have to have a good Pali knowledge, right? Or good English knowledge. How can you say that Buddhaghosa said this if you don't understand it correctly? So even describing, reporting accurately requires some knowledge, but research means going beyond that. Now, I say this point to you emphatically because very often we don't really understand what a research means. We think that we are writing a book and I say that, okay, I wrote a book for my PhD. I mean, what is the meaning of a book if your book doesn't have anything new? You are just reproducing what other people said. Of course, you have written a book. You can write a big book, but so you can see that in the, Buddhist tradition, Burmese tradition itself, that, say, Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw, when he commented on Abhidharma, of course he did not do that for PhD, but we know that he said something new interpretation. Otherwise, why he should write a commentary? If he doesn't have anything new to say, why Mahasi Sayadaw has to write a commentary? 700, 800 pages, why? So you have something new to say, that means you are giving some new knowledge. So Venerables, remember that production of new knowledge is the key term. You are producing new knowledge. Now when we talk about new knowledge, we know that reporting is not new knowledge. Paraphrasing is not new knowledge. Describing is not new knowledge. Of course, all these things can be useful for you when you produce new knowledge. But merely if you are doing only these things, then we know that these things alone, these things only would not be qualified to, call. Now, important question is, what is the new knowledge in Buddhist studies? Is it similar or different from the new knowledge production in natural sciences? If so, how? Now, I talk about new knowledge in Buddhist studies. Now, you are doing Buddhist studies. All of us are doing Buddhist studies. Now, what is the new knowledge we can produce in Buddhist studies? Now, again, in natural sciences, producing new knowledge is, in a way, producing new knowledge is, I'm not saying easy, but you can very clearly identify new knowledge. Suppose you are studying stars and objects in the heaven, a sky. Then you do that with the help of a telescope. So with the telescope, when you observe the sky, suppose you find a star which has never been found by anybody else so far. Then next day you come out and say that I found a star which has not been found by anybody. everybody will be thrilled because you found a new star. Of course, you did not create a star. Star is already there, but nobody had seen it. So you saw it first, and then, you know, scientists will say, okay, you can put your name to it, or your wife's name to it, or whatever. And then what you did is you discovered something. So that's a clear example of new knowledge. So far, up to this point, we did not know about it, but now we know about a new star. So that is a new knowledge, right? And then suppose you are studying botany. You are studying about trees and plants. Suppose these trees get some kind of fungus and the flowers get destroyed. And then you discover the cause of that fungus. That is a new knowledge. Because based on that new knowledge, you can stop that disease and, you know, get the fruits. So, you know, that's a new knowledge. So new knowledge in natural sciences are very easy to identify. Of course, that doesn't mean that very easy to find the new knowledge, but once you find the new knowledge, it is very easy to identify, like finding new star. Same thing in the medical science. Now, you know, there's a lot of research about, say, for example, certain cancer, okay? Now, suppose, you know, some doctor or doctor's team find a cure for that cancer. New knowledge. Maybe that team or that doctor will get Nobel Prize for that because it's such an important thing. So, new knowledge. Now, the problem is, what is the new knowledge in Buddhism? Can we have new knowledge in Buddhism? Are you going to teach the Buddha again? What is this? What is new knowledge in Buddhism? Buddha discovered Four Noble Truths. Buddha teach it to the world. So how can you have new knowledge in Buddhism? What are we talking about? How can you produce new knowledge in Buddhism? Can we produce new knowledge? This is a problem, you know, because we can't say that Buddha has missed some point or something. Four Noble Truths have to be Five Noble Truths or something. No, we can't, you know, because we believe that, you know, Buddha realized the Four Noble Truths, Pratitya Samutpada, you know. So what is the new knowledge in Buddhism? Now again, it's important, new knowledge in the field of Buddhist study, we have to know that we are doing an academic study of something. Now, new knowledge in the field of Buddhist studies or new knowledge in the field of even humanities in general is not like the new knowledge in science. Natural science, new knowledge is very easy to identify. But, you know, in the humanities, it is not very easy. But sometimes, you know, like when academic study was started, like in the today's sense, say like 100 years ago, for example, you could find a manuscript or text which has not been edited so far. Suppose you find a text that has not been edited so far, then you find that palm leaf manuscript and then you transliterate it, copy it, and then you edit it, and then you publish it. You can say that that's a new knowledge because nobody knew about that text so far, right? Nobody knew about that text. So you are giving a new knowledge about the new text to the world. So you are producing a new knowledge. But the issue is, today it is not very easy to find out these texts that have not been edited, right? Because, I mean, it doesn't mean that all the texts have been edited. There can be still many texts, Buddhist texts. But, you know, you have to really do substantial research and identify the texts that have not been edited. Now, for example, I don't know the situation in Myanmar, but say, for example, Thailand, there is a project called Fragile Palm Leaf Project by I think, American scholar. He is collecting a lot of manuscripts from all over Thailand. Now, there can be certain manuscripts, Buddhist texts that are not being published. So if a scholar can get hold of some of these things and do a good edition and, you know, publish it, okay, that can be a new knowledge. But today, most of the texts we know have been edited and translated and studied and published. Okay? So, not very easy to find something unedited, not edited so far. But if you are lucky, maybe you find sometimes, who knows. But then you really have to go out and go through the text and, amidst the dust and, all these things, you have to look at these texts and you really have to see whether these things have been edited and published. Now, that is one way of finding new knowledge in the Buddhist studies. But that particular new knowledge is not very easy because so much has been already published. However, I said earlier also, fact that someone has edited the book, edited the text, doesn't mean that you can't re-edit it. Why? Because if that particular edition has not been done properly, if you can show that this edition has not been done properly, then you can do that edition again. I will give you an example, like, PTS, Pali Text Society. Pali Text Society started in 1880s, now almost about 150 years ago. And then by that time, those scholars in Europe, they did not know much Pali actually. They did not know much Pali. Rhys David studied Pali in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure he had some knowledge. But these people did not have that much of a great knowledge in Pali, but they published Pali text. Those Pali texts originally had a lot of difficulties, problems, deficiencies. But what the PTS has done it, also they are doing it, they are re-editing those texts. They are editing them again. For example, they have edited and published Samyutta Nikaya. But they are now again re-editing Samyutta Nikaya. They know that there can be certain problems. So, the fact that a text has been edited and published doesn't mean that there is no room for you to do it again. But you have to really see that, there are very clearly there are certain problems, and then if you can really show that, okay, this edition has some problems. So, you re-edit it. Then what you do is you add a new knowledge to the subject, okay? Now, this is another example. A book has been edited, but of course, if you find it not satisfactory, you can re-edit it, give more reasons, and then you are adding something to the knowledge. So you are producing some new knowledge by doing that. That's another way. Also, suppose you are studying some theme like karma or pratitya samutpada or whatever. If somebody has said something, a scholarly work, if you feel that that particular thing is wrong, then you can correct it. Now, correcting already existing wrong view is also producing new knowledge. Okay? In the Buddhist studies, if somebody has not done it properly, you give a new interpretation. You correct it. Maybe what you think to be correction will be corrected by somebody else later. Knowledge is like that, because knowledge is gradually developing, right? Because future somebody will come and say that so-and-so is wrong, so-and-so is also wrong, so I am doing it again. But then again, you are producing a new knowledge. Or you can produce, suppose a scholar draws a conclusion based on certain evidence. Suppose you find some fresh evidence in order to support that. So you are not coming up with a new conclusion, but you are bringing in fresh, new evidence to support that. So you can support already existing academic research by new evidence. Then of course you are producing new knowledge. Or you can disprove already existing idea. That also is new knowledge, right? So somebody has written something and you can prove that that is not right. So you can give reasons, give evidence, and you can show that. So that itself is a new knowledge. So therefore, although we may not be able to add to the Buddha's Dhamma, in the Buddhist studies field, we can do many things. There are many areas, many possibilities where we can produce new knowledge. But that new knowledge will not be like discovering a star or discovering a medicine for something. Well, those are really, we can say, in a sense, new. But in our field, anyway, we know that Buddhist studies as a field is a very, very old academic field, more than 2,000 years old. So many people have studied this, okay? So therefore, it's not like any other subject we are studying, one of the oldest subjects in the world. So therefore, looking for finding some new knowledge is not always very easy. But we must remember that, we are looking for some kind of new knowledge. Of course, we can talk about that in detail if you have any questions. So the production of new knowledge. So it is not similar, but of course there are possibilities for us to develop new knowledge. And then I said, what is not research? Of course, reporting, paraphrasing, describing, and all these things are not really research. So these are some of the pretty basic ideas that I wanted to tell you. Now let me next move into the brief history of Buddhist studies. But before moving into brief history of Buddhist studies, do you have any questions or comments or anything you want to clarify about the things which I said so far? Any questions? It's okay if you don't have questions. I mean, everything must be very clear, but but if you have any questions, so you are free to ask any comment. I think two ideas I try to explain: production of new knowledge, and also the ways of producing new knowledge in Buddhist studies. If you are clear about these two things, what we are doing in research is production of new knowledge. And then, what are the possibilities of doing new knowledge? Like science, any knowledge is developed by challenging the existing knowledge, okay? If you are satisfied with the existing knowledge, then of course knowledge will never develop. The main reason for why knowledge is developing, because you are challenging the existing knowledge. If you don't challenge the existing knowledge, world is not going to change. If you think that, Buddha Ghosha is 100% right, then you will never go beyond Buddha Ghosha. If you think that such a great teacher is completely right, you will never go beyond that. Academic studies, you must be able to challenge anyone and everyone. There are no unchallengeable people in the academic field. Anybody should be able to challenge. Okay, as Asanga Tilakaratne, I say something, and I have written some articles and books, but you must be able to say that, at some day, you study these things and say that Asanga Tilakaratne got it wrong. Okay, so how do you correct it? I mean, that is how we do that. Otherwise, you can never justify your existence as a scholar unless you have your own ideas. You are not existing as a scholar if you don't have your own ideas. You cannot have your own ideas unless you challenge the existing system of knowledge. In science, for example, up to Galileo and Kepler, Galileo they invented this telescope. What he saw is, up to this point, people believed that Earth is the center of the universe and sun and everything is going around the Earth. But what Galileo saw was completely, totally opposite of that. He saw that Earth is a very small star. It goes around the sun. So up to that point, we believe that everything goes around the Earth. But, after Galileo, we say that Earth is going around the sun. Now you see, totally opposite view. So it came because existing knowledge was challenged. If you don't challenge, you don't get. So, don't mix up this with respect for the teachers. You have to have a respect for your teachers, it's true. But as a student, you must be able to go beyond your teacher. Otherwise, why do you exist? You can't exist as a scholar. Albert Einstein said something very interesting. Albert Einstein said, he is like a small man who is mounted on giants of the ancient time. Like in the ancient time, you have giants, huge people. But you are such a small person. But even if you are a small person, if you climb on the shoulders of a giant, you can see little beyond more than giant, right? That doesn't mean that you are like the giant, no. But you must be able to see little more than the giant. Understand? So that's what Albert Einstein said. Because without getting the knowledge of the past teachers, you can never be a scholar. So you have to study all the teachers, all the great people who are up to this point. However, when you study up to that point, you must be able to see at least 1 inch beyond them. Otherwise, no point. Isn't that? So others can be giants, but even though you are a small guy, still you are right here because you have acquired all their knowledge into you. So you must be able to see little beyond that. Now this is the way the knowledge develops, okay? So in knowledge, we are not disrespecting the teachers. We are not disrespecting the ancient authors. But we need to really absorb their knowledge and then we need to go beyond. I mean, that is how the knowledge develops. Otherwise, what happens is we are just repeating what the ancient teachers said. There is always room for improvement. There is always room for critical appraisal. But it doesn't mean that, we need to simply criticize others for the sake of criticizing. No. If the ancient ideas are completely correct, then fine. But then you have to critically appraise them. That's the whole thing. So therefore, two things. One thing is the production of knowledge. Research is the production of knowledge. The second is when we produce knowledge, what are in the Buddhist studies field particularly, what do we mean by new knowledge? Okay. So new knowledge is a new piece of information. In the morning session, I referred to this interpretation by one Venerable Jnanavira about Paticca. Now, up to that point, we had Venerable Buddhaghosa's interpretation. But Venerable Jnanavira came up with a new interpretation. Now, that is a good example for new knowledge. However, that doesn't mean that Jnanavira's interpretation cannot be challenged. Somebody can challenge it and somebody can come and show that, no, Jnanavira got it wrong. And that will be a new knowledge then. Okay? So it goes like that. People come up with ideas, they support their ideas with certain evidence, but then if you can prove it again. In our Buddhist studies field, we have quite a lot of interesting examples like that. I remember in my philosophical training, I followed both Professor K.N. Jayathilaka and also Kalupahana, with whom I studied in University of Hawaii, United States. And Professor Kalupahana is K.N. Jayathilaka's pupil. However, now their Buddhist philosophical understanding is pretty much the same. Now, Professor Kalupahana, one of his writings, he showed that one very important discourse taught by the Buddha, which is relevant to Professor K.N. Jayathilaka's thesis, K.N. Jayathilaka has not seen it. So Kalupahana showed that it's called Sabba Sutta. Sabba Sutta in the Sanyutta Nikaya. Now, K.N. Jayathilaka has not seen that. So Professor Kalupahana quoted that sutta and wrote a very short paper. That paper was published in Philosophy East-West, now about 30 years ago. But that short paper on Sabba Sutta brought him international fame. Now you can see that actually he was only adding some information to his teacher's knowledge. But Kalupahana can't be saying, okay, Jayathilaka is my teacher, so I should not do that. No, nothing like that. Jayathilaka has not seen that. Kalupahana happened to see this discourse. He wrote a short paper on that, Sabba Sutta, and that is, so these are some examples where you add to the existing knowledge. Okay, let me move into the next thing. A brief history of Buddhist studies continued. The first Sanghayana after the Parinirvana of the Buddha as the beginning of learning the Dhamma for the preservation of it for the sake of prosperity. This not directly connected to one's realization. The study of the Dhamma for its preservation marks the beginning of what is known as today. Okay, we will go to the first slide. The study of the teaching of the Buddha for the purpose of attaining Nirvana. This was basically the case during the time of the Buddha. The study was only for a purpose, not for study's sake. Reference can be made to Dhammapada statement, Bahumpi che sahitang bhasamano, Appampi che sahitang bhasamano, Silena anupetasya sutenatto navijjati, Sunata dhareta charata dhamme. Now, brief history of Buddhist studies. When we study Buddhist research, it is important for us to know how the academic study of Buddhism started. Now, when we look at the teaching of the Buddha, we can see that the study of the Dhamma was there from the very beginning. Okay? The study of the Dhamma was there from the very beginning because Buddha's path involves Sila, Samadhi and Panya. Now, Panya involves, the knowledge. So, in order to follow the Dhamma, practice the Dhamma, you have to have the knowledge of the Dhamma. Now, suppose Buddha was a god, then you have to only have faith in the Buddha and you will be saved. But of course, Buddha was not a god. Buddha was teaching the Dhamma. So, the Dhamma you have to listen to very carefully, understand it, and then you have to follow the Dhamma. So, that was there from the very beginning. However, at the beginning period of that Sasana, we know that the study of the Dhamma was only to the extent that is useful for the practice, right? So, you don't study anything more than that. Unless it is helpful for your practice, you don't study. So, originally at the very early stage of Buddhism, during the time of the Buddha, idea was that you study Dhamma in order to practice. Beyond the practice, there is no need of learning the Dhamma. Now, in the Dhammapada, Bahumpi che sahitang bhasamano na takkaro hoti naropamatto. Even if you were to recite the Buddhist literature so much, if you are not practicing it, then of course it is no point. And then the next one says, Appampi che sahitang bhasamano, even if you recite the suttas little, if you practice it, then of course you are a participant, you are a owner of the fruits of that monkhood. So Dhammapada makes it very clear that you are studying the Dhamma in order to practice. And there are other places like Sunata, Dhareta, Charata. Sunata means you listen, Dhareta means you keep in mind, Charata means you practice. So Sunata, Dhareta, for what? Charata, practice. So you listen to the Dhamma, you learn the Dhamma in order to practice. Silena anupetasya sutenatho navijjati. Silena anupetasya, if you don't have sila, sutenatho navijjati, there is no meaning of learnedness. So the point I want to make is, learnedness in the Buddha's time was basically, learning was basically to the practice. You learn to the extent that you want to practice and not beyond that. Okay? That was the main idea. However, this situation changed subsequently. How did this situation change is important for us to know. Now, during the time of the Buddha, although the situation was this, we know that the first Sanghayana, after the Parinirvana of the Buddha, as the beginning of learning the Dhamma for the preservation of it, for the sake of posterity. Now, situation changes with the Parinirvana of the Buddha. Now, when the Buddha attained Parinirvana, where was the Dhamma? Buddha attained Parinirvana, Now, when the Buddha was there, Buddha was living, whenever people had a problem, people had a question, they could go to the Buddha and ask about the Dhamma or the Vinaya. You have a problem, you go to the Buddha and you ask. But then when the Buddha is no more, where should you go? How should you get answers? You know, this is an important question. Now, you know about the first Sanghayana. About the first Sanghayana, Chulavagga Panchasatikakhandaka has a report of the first Sanghayana. Now, about the first Sanghayana, Chulavagga says that the Venerable Mahakasyapa and other Arahant convened the first Sanghayana because they heard this unpleasant word by the person called Subhadra, right? Subhadra said that, okay, this great Sraman is gone, we can do anything whatever we like. And so the reason given for the first Sanghayana is that. But I think that is not the most important reason. There was another very important reason why the first Sanghayana had to be done. Now, Sanghayana means Sanghayana. Sanghayana means chanting together. So, you can say Gayana. Gayati means chanting together, reciting together, joint recital or combined recital. That is the Sanghayana. Now, why did the Arahant have to do that? In order to understand the reason, we need to go to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where Buddha says that once Buddha is no more, the Dhamma he taught and the Vinaya he prescribed will be the teacher. Now, this is a very interesting statement by the Buddha. Now, Buddha was almost to attain parinirvana. So, you can see that the disciples were very much sad, and also they were thinking when the Buddha is gone, you know, to whom could they go in order to solve their problems, get the clarifications. Now, they expected, you can see that Buddha will appoint someone in his place, but the Buddha did not appoint anyone in his place. Why? Some people think that Buddha did not appoint another person because Buddhism doesn't believe in personal head or personal, the chief. But I think that is not the right thing. I think the main thing is why Buddha did not appoint a successor, because for the simple reason, a Buddha cannot be appointed, right? Can someone appoint the Buddha? Or a person has to complete the paramitas and become the Buddha? What do you think? According to Buddhism, can you appoint a Buddha? In some religions, okay, the main person dies, you can appoint, you can name a person. But you can't do that. I mean, how can you? Can you appoint another Buddha? I don't think so. You can't appoint another Buddha. However, that does not mean that there was no Sangha Thera. Sangha Thera was there. When the Buddha attained parinirvana, Sangha Thera was Mahakasyapa, right? Sangha Thera was Mahakasyapa. He took over and then he became the leader. So there is no question about that. But on the other hand, Mahakasyapa Thera is not the Buddha. Okay? Mahakasyapa Thera is another member of the Sangha. Now, another member of the Sangha means he is equally subject to the Dhamma and the Vinaya. Now, even the Buddha, Anguttara Nikaya, there is a very interesting statement where Buddha was thinking that whether he should have a teacher. And then Buddha did not see anybody who could become his teacher. Then what the Buddha did? He appointed Dhamma to be his teacher. Now, Venerables, this is a very important, philosophically interesting insight is there. Now, Buddha having Dhamma as his teacher, something you need to understand very carefully. Now, we say Dhamma was taught by the Buddha, right? Okay. But suppose we didn't have Dhamma today, what will happen to the Buddha? Suppose we did not have Dhamma, then what will happen to the Buddha? I mean, Buddha will be just another name, isn't it? Buddha will be just another name. Now, it is because of the Dhamma. Dhamma came to this country, Dhamma came to other countries, people started following the Dhamma. Now you see, everything is because of the Dhamma. Of course, it is true, Dhamma was taught by the Buddha. It is true. But basically, it is the Dhamma. Now we respect the Buddha because of the Dhamma, what he taught, the path he showed. So you can see that, this connection between the Buddha and the Dhamma is something very, very important. So Buddha appointing Dhamma to be his teacher means actually even the Buddha is, Buddha is the Dhamma. Yo Buddham passati, so Dhammam passati. Yo Mang passati, Buddha says, so Dhammam passati. Because Buddha cannot be different from the Dhamma. Okay? Buddha cannot be different from the Dhamma. Buddha cannot be violating the Dhamma because Buddha is the Dhamma really. So ultimately, when the Buddha attained Parinirvana, it is the Dhamma. So what the Buddha said is, Dhamma Buddha taught and the Vinaya prescribed will be your teacher. Now we need to understand the connection between Dhamma and the Vinaya. Now, you should know that from the very beginning, Dhamma was there. Starting from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, Buddha taught the Dhamma. And then Buddha continued. However, Vinaya rules came later. Vinaya rules came later. Now, what is the connection between Dhamma and the Vinaya? Now, in the Dhamma, you get Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Okay? In Dhamma, you get Sila, Samadhi, Panya. What do we get in the Vinaya? Vinaya, you get rules. Rules means if you violate the rule, you get punished. But if you take Sila, Samadhi, Panya, by violating Sila, you not get punished. If you violate the Sila, if you don't observe the Sila, that is your problem. You will not attain Nirvana. But Vinaya rules are different. Vinaya rules are for the Sangha, for the Sasana, for the organization. When you have an organization, if you don't follow the rules, then you get punished. So we obey the rules because we don't want to get punished. But following the Dhamma is different. If you don't follow the Dhamma, nobody is going to punish you. Buddha is not there to punish you. But if you follow the monastic Vinaya rule, there is Sangha to punish you. So there is a very important distinction between Dhamma and the Vinaya. Actually, Dhamma is the main thing. Vinaya is based on the Dhamma. Without Dhamma, there is no Vinaya. And you can see that Buddha said that the Dhamma I taught and the Vinaya I prescribed will be your teacher. Okay? Now, when the Buddha attained Parinirvana, where was Dhamma and the Vinaya? Was it in the books? Where was it? It's a very, very tricky situation because Dhamma was in the mind of some people, memory of some people. We are told that Venerable Ananda memorized many things, whatever the Buddha said after he became the Upattayaka of the Buddha. However, what about the things before that? The Dhamma Buddha taught before Venerable Ananda became the Upattayaka of the Buddha. Where were they? What about the Vinaya rules? We are told that Venerable Upali had the Vinaya rules, and also his pupil. So you can see that Dhamma was in several people's mind. Vinaya was also in several people's mind. They knew, basically the disciples knew the Dhamma and the Vinaya. But now the situation has changed. Situation has changed because in the place of the Buddha now you have Dhamma and the Vinaya. But then if you have any question about the Dhamma, where do you have to go? You have to go to the Dhamma. Now that requires Dhamma to be organized and well kept. Now if you have a Vinaya problem, you don't have Buddha to go, you have to consult the Vinaya rules. Now the Vinaya rules have to be organized, kept in proper manner. Now I think the first Sanghayana was basically, most importantly, to organize the Dhamma and the Vinaya. Not necessarily because the bad word of Subhadra. Of course, he may have said bad words, but the whole point of Sanghayana, chanting together, is to organize, properly organize the Dhamma taught by the Buddha. Now, what is the significance of Sanghayana? Now, Sanghayana means everybody sitting together and chanting the Dhamma is the significance. Now, when you do that, group as a whole, when Dhamma is chanted together, that is indication that everybody accept the Dhamma, accept so chanted. Now, it is not like putting something in the publication and publishing a book. You can't publish it like that. But then on the other hand, for you to accept the Dhamma, symbolically sitting together and chanting, Sanghayana, is a very important thing. So you say that this is the Vinaya rule, and then you sit together and chant it, so that indicates common acceptance by everybody. Okay, this is the Vinaya. Same thing for the Dhamma. You organize the teachings of the Buddha, long discourses, short discourses, connected discourses, and gradual discourses. These things, these are different ways of organizing the teaching of the Buddha. And having organized the teaching of the Buddha, then you memorize these things. At the end of the first Sanghayana, not only they chanted together, they appointed different arahants to be the protectors of these things. Yeah? They appointed different arahants. So the Digha Nikaya suttas were assigned to some arahant, Majjhima Nikaya suttas were assigned to some arahant. So Mahakashyapa, Anuruddha, Venerable Ananda, and Venerable Sariputta's disciples were assigned, asked to be the Bhanakas, or the protectors of the suttas. And the Vinaya was assigned to Venerable Upali and his pupils. Now you see the point I would like to make here is this. Up to the Buddha's parinirvana, Dhamma was studied by people in order to practice. However, after the parinirvana of the Buddha, there is a very important change here. That important change is to assign the Dhamma, study of the Dhamma, to different disciples, to keep that in the memory for the sake of posterity. Now you can see that here you are supposed to master the Dhamma, not necessarily for the sake of attaining nirvana, but for the sake of transmitting it to the later generations. In the discourses of the Buddha, Buddha makes it very clear that even during the time of his time, there were some disciples, like in the Alagadupama Sutta, Buddha says that there are some people, they master the Navanga Sattu Sasana in order to disparage others, in order to debate with others. Buddha said that that is not good. So Buddha did not want people to master the Dhamma in order to win debates, in order to be the great orators, or in order to be great debaters, or to fight with others with the Dhamma knowledge. Buddha said that that is not good. So you can see that Dhamma knowledge was basically for attaining nirvana. However, with the parinirvana of the Buddha, in this new situation, the monks, certain monks had to learn the Dhamma and keep that Dhamma in the memory, not only for their attainment of nirvana, but for the sake of people who are coming after, or for the generations that follow. Now this I would call the beginning of what we call today academic study of Buddhism. Actually, that is not the academic study of Buddhism as we say today, but of course that is the beginning of. Now the main point is that was the beginning when some of the Buddhist monks were required to learn the Dhamma, not for their salvation, not for their liberation, but for the preservation of the doctrine of the Buddha. Now, preservation of the doctrine of the Buddha became very important. In fact, if they did not preserve it, we will not have it. Finally, during the Ashoka's period, when Buddhism was transmitted to different countries, Buddhism was sent into Suvarnabhumi, we believe that this area, and also Buddhism was sent into Sri Lanka, and the texts that were sent into Sri Lanka were preserved there, and during the Vattagamini Abhaya, 1st century BCE, these texts were committed into writing. Up to that point, the texts were kept in memory. But you can see that the monks had to memorize the Dhamma in order to keep it safe. Now, this new change also made some changes in the monastic life. Up to that point, monks were, learning the Dhamma in order to practice. But then subsequently what happened was, there arose a group of people, group of monks who are educated, who are learning the Dhamma. Now this is how subsequently in the Buddhist studies, Buddha Sasana, we have this distinction of Gantha Dura and we had two different groups of monks gradually emerging in the Buddha Sasana. One group of monks was called Gantha Dura. Dura means yoke. Yoke is that crossbar that you put in the bullock's neck in order to draw the cart, which is not a very good metaphor really. I mean, it sounds like a burden. But of course, the book was the burden, so Grantha Dura. And then Vipassana Dura, now that is somewhat funny because Vipassana meditation is the whole life of a Buddhist, right? Now how can it be a Dura? It be a burden, But you can see there was a change here. Change is that some people were required to learn the text. And gradually they are developed a certain way of attitude about this. That attitude is, if you remember the Dhammapadatta Katha, in the Dhammapadatta Katha you have Cakkupala Theravattu. Now Cakkupala Theravattu, Dhammapadatta Katha says something very interesting. There Cakkupala Thera says is, because he is old, he cannot practice Gantha Dura, therefore he will practice Vipassana Dura. Now what is this? So you meditate only because you are old. You meditate only because you are not capable of learning the Dhamma. Now you see there is something very, very different attitude towards it. But although Cakkupala Thera's story belonged to the Buddha's time, you don't need to think that this distinction and this attitude was there during the Buddha's time. When the Buddha was living, there was no Gantha Dura or Vipassana Dura, okay? There was nothing like that. Everybody learned the Dhamma in order to practice, and that's all. You learn the Dhamma insofar as you need it to practice and not beyond that. So there is no problem about it. However, although these words are put into the mouth of Cakkupala Thera during the time of the Buddha, these two Duras don't belong to the time of the Buddha. They started subsequently. After the first Sanghayana only, this division started, because here we can see that a generation of monks started memorizing the word of the Buddha in order to preserve it. And subsequently we have, in the Buddhist tradition, we have what is called Bhanaka. Now Bhanaka comes from Bhasati. Bhanaka comes from Bhasati. Bhasati means you recite the word of the Buddha. So those who recite the word of the Buddha are Bhanakas. Now Bhanaka means gradually Bhanakas became the experts. So there were Diga Bhanakas who were experts in the Diga Nikaya, Majjhima Bhanakas, expert in the Majjhima, and the Vinaya, Abhidhamma, and subsequently they became Bhanakas. And Bhanakas were the experts. Now, if you have any problem about Diga Nikaya, you go to the Diga Bhanaka. If you have any problem about the Vinaya, you go to the Vinaya expert. You go to the Majjhima Bhanaka. Now, you see, when the Buddha said that after him, Dhamma and the Vinaya will be the teacher, of course, what it means is, you have to have someone who can interpret, who can teach these things. It is only in the 1st century BCE that the Dhamma was written into books. But before that, they were not written, so there were no books. Up to that point, Dhamma was in the people's mind, so in the memory. So what I want to show you is how now today we are talking about Buddhist research in the field, in the sense of academic study. Now, I am just giving you the history, how academic study started in Buddhism. Okay? So, it did not start from the very beginning. During the time of the Buddha, it was not there. But subsequently, there was a need for the monks to know about the Dhamma so that they can preserve the teaching of the Buddha for the posterity. So, this is basically what happened after the parinirvana of the Buddha. Subsequently, when we talk about Gantadhura and Vipassana Dhura, we can see that quite a lot of changes have taken place. Now, in Sri Lankan history, there is a very interesting incident. In the 1st century BCE, during the time of Vattagamini Abhaya, there was a very severe famine, no rain, so no food for the monks. So many people were dying, and then finally a lot of monks had to come to the neighboring country, India, to save their life. But there were some few monks who were in Sri Lanka, they keep in the memory of the Dhamma with a lot of difficulty. And after long 14 years period, the famine was over, and then the monks got together. Those who went to India came back, and the first thing they did was they memorized, they checked their memory, whether the Dhamma was remembered by them accurately. Of course, they checked their memory was good, there was no problem. However, this incident showed them how risky it is to keep the Dhamma in the memory. Because if the last person with the memory dies, then that whole Dhamma book would have died. Even this time, there was a problem. The book called Mahanidesa was remembered by only one monk. And that monk did not have a very good name for his sila. His sila was suspected by others. Now, in the ancient time, if you want to learn the text from that monk, you have to go to him and pay homage to him and do all services, and then only you can get the book out of him, right? But then the good monks with sila did not want to go to that person because his sila was questionable. But then on the other hand, there is no alternative. Unless you go to that person and learn, that Niddesa will be completely gone. So ultimately the monks had to go to that particular monk and learn the Niddesa. However, incidents of this nature showed that keeping the Dhamma in the memory is a very, very risky thing. So they decided to copy it down into the books. Now, when this happened, there was a very interesting development. The development is among these bhikkhus. Now we say that there were Dhammakatikkas and Pansukulikas. Here we have Gantadhura and Vipassana Dhura, right? During the 1st century BCE, there were Dhammakatikkas and Pansukulikas. Dhammakatikkas were the monks who were preachers of the Dhamma. That means learned monks. That means Gantadhura monks. And Pansukulikas means the monks who wore Pansukula robe, which means, the who lived in the forest, who were meditators. They would have been Vipassana Dhura. So, two terms are Gantadhura, Dhammakatika and Pansukulika. Between the Dhammakathikakas and Pansakulikas, there arose a question. The question was, what is the root of the sasana? Pariyatti or Patipatti? Now, Pariyatti means the learning, Patipatti means the practice. So, the question arose between these two groups is, what is the root, Moolam? Pariyatti nuko udahu sasanasa Moolam udahu Patipatti. Whether it is Pariyatti, learning, or Patipatti, practice. In this debate, who won? Dhammakathikakas won, because Dhammakathikakas are the speakers, they know Dhamma quite a lot, so they won the debate, which means Pariyatti, learning, became more important than practice. Because learning people said that if you don't know the Dhamma, how can you practice it? For a simple argument. If you don't know the Dhamma, you can't practice. So you have to know the Dhamma. So we are the people who know the Dhamma. For you to practice, you have to ask from us. So something like that. So Dhammakathikakas won, Pansakulikas lost. But what do you think about this question? In the history, in the Theravada history, at some point, this question arose. Which is the more important thing? Which is the root of the sasana? Practice or the learner? I think basically my own personal understanding is, I think the question is a wrong question. Question is a wrong question. The funny thing is this, when you ask a wrong question, you don't get the right answer, right? You ask a wrong question, you get a wrong answer. Do you think the answer is right? The Pariyatti, learnedness, is the root of the... No. Actually, it is only the half. You can't say that learning is the root. Learning is for the practice. Practice is for the Pativeda, realization. So, Pariyatti, Patipatti, Pativeda, you cannot separate from each other. You cannot say which is more important or which is less important. All three are dependently arisen, depend on each other. So you have to have Pariyatti in order to Patipatti. Both Pariyatti and Patipatti ultimately leads to Pativeda. So if you don't have Pativeda, then there is no point of having either Pariyatti or Patipatti. But anyhow, this is very important. At some point in the history, this happened in the Sri Lankan context. Among the Theravada monks, they thought that learnedness was very important. However, all along in the history, we can see there was a distinction between Gantadura and Vipassanadura. Some people were learned, some people were practitioners, right? And then some were Pansakulikas, some were Dhammakathikakas. Now, when you are a Dhammakathika, you are a learned person, you are a public speaker, you get respect from everybody. But Pansakulikas, nobody knows about them because they are in the forest, they don't come to limelight. So you can see that there was this distinction going on. Anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail into that. The point I wanted to make you was, this is how gradually the study of the Dhamma, as the study of Dhamma started and evolved in the Buddhist tradition. Okay. Subsequently, we have Gantadura and the learned tradition, where Buddhist monks became learned people. So within the Buddhist countries, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand, China, Japan, or anywhere, Buddhist monks became very, very learned people because the learning became a part of the Buddhist tradition. Okay. Now this is the traditional picture of the learning. Then we will come to the more recent picture of learning, how the academic study of Buddhism started in the modern time. However, today I am not going to go into that because I think I will wind up at this point and leaving it open for rest of, we have few minutes, so that if you have any questions, we can have a discussion. So thank you very much. Yes. Can you give them, yeah, okay.
Hello. Hello.
That's okay, you can sit, that's fine. Anyhow, okay, yeah.
So you, in your speech, for research, we must have a new knowledge. So for us, we have still difficult to find what kind of title or what sort of things we have to get a new knowledge. Because we have, traditionally, we have learned recognizing from the teacher and like that. We don't ask the question. We are not familiar to ask the question with what we are reading. So how can you comment or give advice for us?
Thank you very much. That's a very practical question in research. Now, one thing is when you start doing a research, your question is, you don't have, you don't know about a research topic or, what to do. You don't know about an area in which you can produce a new knowledge. That's a important question. But, as a practical difficulty, this difficulty is not only for you personally, not only for this group. Any researcher has to face this problem. Any researcher has to face this problem because at the beginning of research, we don't have much idea. Now, this is why, for example, if you are doing coursework masters, for one whole year, you are just doing various courses and reading various texts and reading various articles. That is a time you have to keep your eye whether, there is something that you can really get hold of. So the whole idea of doing the courses, doing coursework, reading many books, talking to other friends, this type of time is required for you to get an idea. Now sometimes, people go to some of your teachers and they say, please give me a topic, okay? But, as a researcher, that is a very bad habit. If you go and ask from somebody, okay, give me a topic, then your teacher will have to think about it and give you a topic, but it is not a part of your thinking. But if you read and if you think, if you read and if you keep on thinking, maybe after 1 or 2 years at least, you come to know something. It's like this, you read something and you follow that, and then you realize that no, that has no future. So you leave behind that and you read something else and follow that little bit, and then, okay, no, that's not going to work. So you read something else. Like that, you trial and error. But every time, suppose you read something thinking that this is a good research, after reading and everything, you find that no, this is not good. But when you give that up, you have already gained a lot of knowledge. So you read something else, and also you give up that. But when you give up that, you have got another good knowledge about. So when you give up like that 3-4 things, then you become a mature student, You know about this particular thing, you know that somebody has done about it, and there is nothing much you to do, you know about this particular thing. Like that, you experiment with several things. Now, for example, for me, I wrote my dissertation on the problem of ineffability of Buddhist religious experience. Ineffability means the belief that, certain things cannot be described by language. So that was my research. But, in order to fix that topic, it took me more than 2 years. I was reading and thinking, and talking to teachers, talking to friends, and they say, oh, look at that paper, look at this paper, or read this book, or talk to this person. So you do all these things. But by doing all these things, you get a lot of experience. That's why, Reverend, just after your first degree, you can't do a research. Because you must really know the field. You must really have read some important works in the field. Now, if you don't read anything, if you don't do anything, how can you do a research? You don't have any raw material. Now, the thing is, sometimes you can go to your teacher, and if your teacher say, okay, do this, but then that is not part of your experience. Because your teacher may know that, nobody has done that, but teacher's knowledge is not important. It is you are the person who really should do that. If your teacher is also writing your dissertation, then that's a different thing. But if not, so your question is very important, but there is no easy or shortcut for that. You really have to spend some time, but while you do that, whenever you read something, you have to have a critical eye. Actually, at the beginning of our academic career, every time you read something, you feel that, oh, this is great. You read something else, this is great. You read something else, this is great. That is how it is at the beginning. But when you read like that, maybe several things, this is not that good. There is a problem here. So you start seeing problems. And then you are ready to do a research. Okay? So that is a maturity that comes with the time. So my advice is actually there is no shortcut for that, but you need to keep on reading, keep on thinking, and also keep on discussing with your peers, your friends, your teachers. You can always go to your teacher and ask, is this a good thing? But if you just go empty hand, please give me a topic, that's not a good thing. But you take a topic, you take a paper and say, what do you think about this? I see this problem here. What do you think? Now that you can ask from your teacher. Then your teacher can help you. Because you don't go to teacher empty-handed. You have something, right? You go with something. You go and ask, I read this article, I find this problem. What do you think? Then teacher will say, yes, there is a problem. Or teacher will say, no, there is, like that. So, Reverend, getting a research topic is not something overnight. Some people, long time ago, there were things like that. I will give you an example. In Sri Lankan professor Y. Karunadas, he wrote his PhD dissertation on Buddhist analysis of matter in the Abhidhamma Rupa. The interesting thing is, by that time, he did that in late 60s, nobody had written anything about Buddhist analysis of matter. So you can start writing because there is nobody who has written about it. But today, after about 50 years, so much has been written about Buddhist analysis of matter, including Professor Y. Karunadas' book. So if you want to do a research on Buddhist analysis of matter, Rupa, today, you have to start reading from Y. Karunadas and other things. So our job is today not easy. If you were born 50 years ago, research would have been a little bit easy because Buddhist studies, they just started. But today so much has been studied. So looking for a theme is not very easy. Thank you for your question, but it has to come from experience, reading, thinking, read and think. And always as a student, you must try to see what is wrong with this. That is not a good thing in the life, okay? But in academic life, you always read something to see what is problem in there. Otherwise, you don't have existence, If you can't find problems in other people's writing, you don't exist as a scholar. So don't do that in the real life. Social life, don't do that. But academic life, see what is wrong with that.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
I have an idea to make a new in research. So I read some book, especially concerning with psychology, cosmology, and ecology. But Buddhism and ecology, I had ever read 2 books from Sri Lanka and another book from Alpha Press. Yeah, Alpha Press. But And I trust their referring, especially their referring is not primary poly test. Especially they give reference secondary source, such as the Bose upper price from LIDEC. Why they don't give Buddha was not or primary source in their reference? I'd
Well,
like to know.
Yeah, I mean ecology, particularly if you take ecology, you know that the study of nature is as a discipline, as a subject, it is a new thing, okay? But then your question is important because you are asking why those people who write on them do not refer to primary sources, right?
Yes.
Actually, it's very interesting. In a way, we can say that Buddha has not said anything about ecology, because the kind of problems that we exist and experience today did not exist during the time of the Buddha. So Buddha has not said anything about them directly, it's true. But that doesn't mean that there are no insights, teachings in the teaching of the Buddha that are relevant to ecological problems, Reverend. That you have to really be able to creatively think. Now, I will give you an example from my own academic life. Now, I remember for my first degree, I wrote something in Sinhala language. If I translate that into English, it's something like human problems from a Buddhist perspective. Now, in that, my essay, I was just about 23, 22 years old by that time. But somehow or other, by that time, Reverend, I was reading quite a lot of English journals like Reader's Digest, Times, Newsweek, and those days, of course, television was not very much there. But I was reading a lot of international material. So then I had some understanding about the situation of the world, like, you know, problems in the world, pollution, urbanization, and, you know, things like that. Then when I wrote this actually dissertation for my first degree, people ask, how can there be anything in Buddhism about urbanization? How can there be anything about pollution, air pollution in Buddhism? Because during the time of the Buddha, we don't talk about air pollution or any kind of pollution. Water pollution, no water pollution. Urbanization, no urbanization. Industrialization, nothing called industrialization. So people ask, how do you talk from Buddhism about these problems? Now, you know, the interesting thing is, although it is true that there was no industrialization, no urbanization during the time of the Buddha, the problems that arise because of these things are ultimately human suffering. So Buddha has talked about the suffering, dukkha satya. Now you see, although the problems are new, the causes of the problems are very old. Okay? Causes of the problems are very old. Now, today we are fighting world wars with the airplanes and bombs and, you know, all these things today. But then King Kosala did not have airplanes, King Kosala did not have bombs, but he was also fighting, right? He was also fighting, we are also fighting. What is the difference? Difference is the way we are fighting has been changed, but the fact that we are fighting has not changed, right? So the way we are using bombs, bombers, and, you know, go and put so much bombs. So Reverend, you know, that's the issue. The world has really, in a fundamental sense, not changed. So my conclusion was, human problems are human problems anytime. Only difference is, we do it different manner. I remember I wrote another example. Example is like, during the time of the Buddha, maybe King Kosala wanted to have a very nice chariot with white horses, right? But today nobody wants chariot with white horses, right? What do you want? You want a Mercedes limousine or something, right? But then our desire for Mercedes limousine or King Kosala's desire for chariot with white horses, no different. So, you know, the important thing is Buddhism is applicable irrespective of this time difference, because fundamental problems are the same. So, ecology, actually in this particular book, I wrote my dissertation in 1972. So much before you were born, I think. But then, there was enough material for me to talk about ecology and air pollution and the water pollution. So there is, only thing is we need to look from a different point of view. You change the point of view and then you see Buddha has spoken about these problems. Although Buddha has not spoken about air pollution, there is a lot of Dhamma that you can use in order to do this thing. So Venerable, it's very important you ask it. So try to see the fundamental reasons of doing these things. And then you can see that Buddhism is applicable. So urbanization, abortion, birth control, you take any modern subject, there is something. Or even subject like cloning. Buddha has nothing cloning, right? But today cloning is an issue. But you must be able to analyze it according to Buddhism, right? Because we are thinking in a very conventional manner. But you change the thinking little bit, you can apply Buddhism to it. So I'm not saying that Buddhism has the answer to everything. No, that's not what I'm saying. But any modern problem, you must not simply give up simply because the problem is modern. Say, for example, take population problem, population growth. Buddha never talked about population growth, population problem. But today population can be a problem. But then what are the reasons? You can make an analyze from the point of view of Buddhism. Now suppose the society is rich, society is self-sufficient, then would the population will be a problem? No. A family has 10 children, but if that family can support the 10 children, so what? No problem. So, the reasons are population is not the problem itself. Maybe population becomes a problem when the resources are limited. So like that, there are ways of doing that. So what I would like to do maybe in future in this class is you can come up with your own research theme. We can have some kind of the discussion and how to make that. Yes.
Okay. Air pollution or water pollution. This problem is today problem. But for example, Dhammapala study. Everyone in this village observes 5 precepts. The weather is very good. If we can find those weather condition, weather's our meter condition, and we can solve body emission. For example, you feel angry, your temperatures in your body are changes. This body emission will give side effect all over the world. It is a condition of weather changes. And it is a condition of air pollution. Another issue of Buddha, and we can't know directly what is the air pollution like that. But we can make, for example, alcohol. Alcohol, we can find out and air pollution, who is a contemporary of George Bush in the United States. I think you guys already know. In brief, he can find out physical side effect. If as I'm a Buddhist man, as a Buddhist, if we can find out mental side effort to settle the global warming problem for the world, it is a new one, I think. How do you think of my opinion?
Well, Venerable, actually what you say is like, how our mental and physical condition can affect the weather, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's
for
the main
example,
thing.
such as the mind-bone matter like that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But the issue is this. We must have, it may be true that, the way we think and our physical atmosphere can be affecting the atmosphere outside.
Yes.
But the only thing is, because we are talking about the weather, because we are talking about the measurable things in the world, we must be able to measure it, Reverend. Now the measuring instruments, you don't find it in the Buddha's teaching, but measuring instruments, you have to borrow it from the modern science.
Yes.
Now this is where you make the connection, okay? Now simply we can say that when I am angry, from my body, maybe some heat comes. So when the millions of people are angry, a lot of heat comes and, it can affect the nature. That could be. but how are we going to prove that? Now we must find a way to prove it.
We
We
need
must
research.
find a way to measure it. Otherwise, it becomes only idea. Now this is actually when it comes to particularly the social science research, I will explain it to you more. Interesting thing is it is not enough for us to make claims. We must prove it. Now in a scientific thing, they can always say from these industries, this much hot air is emitted to the atmosphere, so they can calculate it, measure it, and then they can say that, okay, ozone layer is going to be destroyed and the rain is going to be changed and all these things. But Reverend, in the Buddhist studies, I am not saying it is impossible. Certain Buddhist studies we have to combine with science, because otherwise we cannot prove it. Now there are other areas like, particularly if you take Venerable Dalai Lama, he is doing some, for now several years, he is conducting research with, what is called cognitive sciences and the brain and also the meditation. Now for that they are using modern machinery. Like, in the modern machinery you have things here and all over the head so that you can measure what is going on in your head. Now, that is where the meditation and the modern techniques come in together. So now, up to this point, we believe that when we keep on meditating on Maitri, ultimately you become a Maitri person. But now with this research, they are capable of proving that how it happens. Because now they have discovered there is some kind of change in your brain as a result of that. So, that is the scientific way of, so the challenge is not our ideas, but some of these things we have to find a way to measure it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So, that we will have to work on, Reverend. That's not an easy thing, but that's not impossible. If we really think that, that type of rays is emitted from our bodies and, that affects the climate, that's a good hypothesis. But hypothesis has to be established.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Okay, today my throat is also not very good, so we will wind up from that then.
Dear Dhamma brother, sister, thank you very much for your attending and participation in the discussion. So teacher's throat now is getting hot because you force him to speak a lot. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Teacher, your knowledge of English, with authority or glory, with we resolve to make better the world we live in, to build our sasana to the best of our ability. Arupshupsiya iloka we pawa the mai mayaiseya seima mecha mana mapa to swaya pshin to dadana to piwago taya semu Lola Byu